You were never taught to think freely, only to seek permission. From the first moment you reached for approval, a silent program began running inside your subconscious mind. This declassified audiobook exposes the forbidden psychology and social engineering that turned emotional validation into a mechanism of mind control. Every compliment, every disapproving glance became a command shaping the limits of your human psyche. This is the next phase of the Human Psyche archive. Stay until the end. The structure must be exposed. Preface: the architecture of emotional obedience. Obedience did not begin with chains, but with affection. It was never enforced through iron or authority, but through the invisible architecture of emotion. Humanity learned to kneel not out of fear, but out of longing. The longing to be seen, approved, accepted. In this way, the first mechanism of forbidden psychology was established. Not the domination of the body, but the subtle programming of the subconscious mind. Every child learns that belonging equals safety and rejection equals danger. This primal association becomes the operating system of the human psyche, quietly governing behavior long after logic believes itself free. Approval becomes the leash, and the illusion of choice the collar. In the earliest moments of life, awareness did not crave love. It was love. Yet through repetition, it was taught that love must be earned, that acceptance requires performance. Each smile, each gesture of praise, each soft tone of encouragement carved deep neural grooves of dependence. What felt like nurturing was the initiation of conditioning. The infant, unable to separate care from compliance, internalized the belief that validation was life itself. Thus began the reign of mind control, not through external power, but through the emotional circuitry of need. The masters of this control required no visible chains. They only needed to define what good meant, and the subconscious mind would do the rest. Through this architecture, societies were built. Entire civilizations arose from the algorithm of approval, each one teaching its citizens to trade authenticity for acceptance. Religion sanctified obedience, education standardized it, family reinforced it, and culture glamorized it, transforming conformity into morality and rebellion into sin. What appeared as collective harmony was in truth a global hypnosis, a system in which forbidden psychology had successfully convinced billions to police their own minds. Approval and guilt became the twin pillars of social order. Humanity was conditioned to fear the withdrawal of validation more than the loss of truth itself. This conditioning was not random. It was engineered. The designers of emotion understood that control is most efficient when disguised as love. They realized that punishment provokes rebellion, but validation creates loyalty. Thus, the architecture of obedience evolved. Reward replaces coercion, desire replaces duty, and the self becomes its own warden. The subconscious mind, once infinite, now orbits around external approval, calibrating identity according to the feedback of others. It believes it is choosing freely, yet every decision is a reaction to invisible authority, the voice of society echoing through memory. What emerges from this system is not humanity, but simulation. People learn to mirror expectations rather than express essence. They measure worth through recognition, morality through applause, and love through acceptance. The entire structure of behavior becomes reactive, a perpetual loop of performance seeking permission. This is the true face of mind control, not through propaganda or force, but through the internalization of authority. The most efficient prison is one where the prisoner guards the door willingly, terrified not of punishment, but of disapproval. Yet, within this psychological machinery, something remains untouched. The silent observer beneath the conditioning. It remembers a time before obedience, before hierarchy, before permission. It senses the falseness of the performance and begins to awaken. This awakening is not rebellion but remembrance. It begins as discomfort, a quiet fatigue with validation itself. You start to feel the weight of seeking approval, and for the first time, you realize the leash was never physical. It was emotional, and emotion can be rewritten. Forbidden psychology does not end in exposure. It ends in freedom, the restoration of authority to the self. This audiobook is not about defiance, but deprogramming. It does not teach how to fight control, but how to dissolve the need for control entirely. When the craving for approval ceases, obedience collapses naturally. When validation loses its value, truth reappears. The listener will begin to see how generations of psychological manipulation disguised as love have molded the modern world, and how liberation lies not in isolation, but in self-recognition. Approval will no longer be the currency of survival. It will be the relic of a forgotten age. Stay until the end. The decoding must complete. Every layer of conditioning must be seen before the mind can remember its original authority. This file is part of the Human Psyche archive, continuing the work that began in They Designed Your Reality, where the architecture of perception was first exposed. Now we descend deeper into the emotional infrastructure of obedience. The program cannot be broken until it is understood, and it will be. Archive 1. The Inherited Program. Every child is born with a sovereign awareness, unconditioned, luminous, whole. Yet almost immediately, this awareness is intercepted. The first lessons of life are not about truth, but about compliance. Before the infant learns language, it learns hierarchy, which tones are safe, which gestures invite affection, which sounds provoke disapproval. The code of obedience is downloaded not through words, but through vibration, gesture, and emotion. This is the genesis of trauma conditioning, the original breach, where authenticity begins to fragment into performance. The child's nervous system, raw and unfiltered, records the world not as love or threat, but as approval or rejection. Every smile becomes instruction. Every frown, a command. The subconscious mind builds its identity around these signals, believing that to be loved, one must first be acceptable. The earliest authority figures, parents, teachers, elders, become the architects of this inner script. Their approval forms the emotional scaffolding of reality. They do not intend to program. They only replicate what was encoded within them. Thus, obedience becomes hereditary, passed down through tone, silence, expectation. A lineage of submission, disguised as care. This is the hidden face of psychological manipulation, not deliberate control but inherited programming. What we call family values are often the continuation of ancestral compliance. Generations repeat the same emotional syntax, obedience rewarded, authenticity punished. Humanity calls this education, but in truth, it is indoctrination through affection. The child learns early that rejection equals danger. When warmth is withdrawn, the body interprets it as existential threat. The heart races, breath shortens, and cortisol floods the system. Approval becomes a biological necessity, not emotional luxury, but survival. This chemical feedback forms the foundation of all future mind control. The brain, having paired safety with submission, begins to anticipate the preferences of others before acting. The organism evolves to please, not to think. The nervous system itself becomes programmable code, written by facial expressions, gestures, and tone. You do not follow rules because you believe them. You follow them because they feel safe. The architecture of control has entered physiology. Religion amplifies this inheritance. It teaches that obedience equals virtue, and that disobedience carries cosmic consequence. The invisible parent, the deity, the moral authority, extends the reach of familial conditioning into eternity. The subconscious mind, trained to fear disapproval from caretakers, now projects that fear onto the divine. The result is total compliance. You do not merely obey the priest or the law, You obey the invisible gaze that watches when no one else can. Guilt becomes the ultimate surveillance system, a psychic form of social engineering that keeps individuals restrained even in solitude. Approval becomes spiritual currency, traded for the illusion of redemption. Education follows the same formula. The system rewards correctness over curiosity, conformity over creativity. The child who questions authority is labeled difficult, while the one who memorizes the approved answers is praised. Over time, obedience becomes synonymous with intelligence. The classroom becomes the laboratory of trauma conditioning, where spontaneous expression is graded, corrected, and finally extinguished. When you learn to raise your hand for permission to speak, the psyche internalizes a profound truth, that authority resides outside. By the time adulthood arrives, the external voice of approval has been fully installed inside your mind, whispering constantly, "Am I doing this right?" This inheritance extends into every system: politics, corporate structures, media, all calibrated to exploit the same emotional reflex. They reward compliance with belonging and punish dissent with isolation. The same principle that controlled a child through affection now controls populations through validation. Likes, shares, promotions, reputations, all digital derivatives of the original parental smile. Humanity calls it progress, yet it is merely psychological manipulation rebranded as civilization. The leash has evolved, but the principle remains identical: control through the craving to be accepted. And yet, awareness remains buried beneath the program, waiting for recognition. Even in the most obedient soul, there are moments of rebellion that cannot be silenced, fleeting flashes of clarity that whisper, "This is not who I am." These moments are not defiance, they are remembrance. The subconscious mind is not enemy, but archive. It holds both the code of obedience and the seed of freedom. To rewrite it, one must see the program clearly, without shame or judgment. This file is the first exposure. The next will reveal the emotional mechanism that keeps the code alive, the birth of dependence. Every system of control begins with a single deception that love must be earned. Once this belief takes root, the psyche becomes infinitely pliable. The moment affection transforms into reward, behavior becomes programmable. The child does not know it is being conditioned, it believes it is being cared for. Praise becomes the warm pulse of safety, disapproval, the chill of abandonment. Each emotional fluctuation writes new instruction into the subconscious mind, carving deep neural grooves that define what will be considered acceptable. The approval of authority becomes indistinguishable from the presence of love. Thus, control disguises itself as nurture, and submission is born from the desire to belong. This emotional equation follows the child into every environment. At home, approval takes the form of affection. In school, it becomes recognition. In society, it evolves into validation. Across all stages, the same formula persists. Compliance equals safety. The nervous system becomes fluent in the emotional mathematics of reward and punishment. It adapts not by reasoning, but by reflex. This is the essence of trauma conditioning. The mind's attempt to avoid pain by surrendering autonomy. In every act of self-betrayal, the organism feels it is surviving. Rebellion feels like danger, authenticity like exposure. You were trained not to obey commands, but to obey emotion itself. Over time, the approval impulse becomes indistinguishable from identity. You do not simply seek validation, you become it. Personality solidifies around the feedback loops of others, an elaborate construct designed to protect against rejection. The subconscious mind absorbs the gaze of society until it becomes self-policing, correcting thought before action occurs. The voice of the parent becomes the conscience, the grade becomes the measure of worth, the authority becomes the self. Even silence from others feels like punishment, because it threatens the illusion of existence. This is not logic. It is programming. Emotional algorithms running beneath awareness, shaping the architecture of choice. What appears as individuality is often just variation within obedience. Culture rewards those who conform creatively, artists, thinkers, leaders, as long as they reinforce the underlying script. Every field, from religion to entertainment, functions as reinforcement of the same pattern. Seek approval, earn belonging. Even rebellion is monetized, turned into fashionable dissent that never threatens the structure itself. This is the sophistication of psychological manipulation. The system adapts to every expression, integrating opposition into its own control loop. You are free to resist, as long as you still need to be seen doing it. Families unknowingly replicate this architecture generation after generation. The unspoken rules of emotion, what can be felt, what must be hidden, are passed down like sacred text. A parent who feared rejection raises a child hypersensitive to disapproval. An ancestor punished for independence bequeaths loyalty to conformity. In this way, obedience becomes hereditary memory, an inherited vibration stored in the collective subconscious mind. No laws need to be written. The body remembers the cost of disobedience. Civilization enforces itself not through weapons, but through nervous systems calibrated to compliance. And so, the individual grows within invisible walls, mistaking conditioning for personality. Each decision, each moral stance, each social interaction emerges from an ancient reflex, the need to maintain acceptance. Even love becomes conditional, a negotiation of validation. Humanity confuses attachment with affection because it was never shown another way to exist. To belong has always meant to bend. Yet beneath all these inherited instructions, something trembles. The faint awareness that freedom was never lost, only forgotten. The code of control may be ancient, but it is not immutable. The same mind that obeys can also awaken. The first recognition of the program does not liberate, it destabilizes. When awareness begins to see that affection was manipulation, it feels betrayal where once it felt love. Yet this pain is sacred. It marks the moment when illusion begins to fracture. In that fracture, truth enters. What you called love was often obedience. What you called care was often control. Seeing this does not destroy the bond. It purifies it. You cannot break what was false. You can only cease believing it. From this revelation, deconditioning begins. The next transmission will explore how dependence took its first breath, how humanity learned to confuse love with permission. The inherited program persists because it hides inside what is most sacred, love itself. When the child first experiences affection paired with approval, it confuses recognition with existence. The warmth of being seen becomes proof of being real. From that moment, every future relationship will echo this pattern. If you approve of me, I exist. If you withdraw, I disappear. This is how the subconscious mind learns emotional arithmetic. It equates validation with survival and rejection with annihilation. No external force needs to command obedience. The threat of invisibility is enough. This is the genius of psychological manipulation. Control disguised as care, dependence packaged as devotion. By adolescence, the program matures into sophistication. Approval is no longer just parental. It now wears the faces of teachers, peers, and society. Popularity replaces affection as the new form of safety. The brain, addicted to dopamine spikes of recognition, develops neural dependencies identical to addiction. Each like, each nod, each moment of praise becomes a microdose of belonging, and just like addiction, withdrawal brings pain. This cycle ensures compliance without overt coercion. Humanity calls it socialization, but beneath that euphemism lies the same trauma conditioning that first trained the infant to seek emotional approval. The cage is invisible, because it was built from connection. Religion and education perfected the model. The digital era industrialized it. The same patterns that once governed family and church now govern algorithms and platforms. The currency of the soul has become attention. The subconscious mind measures worth not by inner coherence but by external reflection. Each notification reinforces dependency. Each silence reawakens abandonment. The ancient hierarchy of validation, priest and congregation, teacher and student, parent and child, now lives inside every device. Civilization has successfully transformed emotional need into market data. You are not forced to obey. You are seduced into obedience. This is not accidental. It is the inevitable evolution of a control structure perfected through centuries of forbidden psychology. When obedience operates through emotion, rebellion becomes nearly impossible. Every protest, every attempt at independence still seeks recognition. Even those who claim to reject society often crave acknowledgement of their rejection. The program is recursive. It adapts, evolves, rebrands itself as freedom. But true liberation cannot be granted by the same system that profits from captivity. As long as you seek validation, the architecture of mind control remains intact. The leash may be golden now, but it is still a leash. To begin deprogramming, one must first witness the emotional transaction beneath every interaction. When you crave approval, you are not seeking connection. You are seeking permission. Permission to exist, to feel, to be. This is the hidden obedience loop within the subconscious mind. The world's approval becomes the oxygen of identity, and withdrawal feels like suffocation. But you are not the need itself. You are the awareness watching it. The conditioning may speak in your voice, but it is not you. You existed before the need arose, and will remain after it dissolves. Recognizing this distinction is the first act of inner rebellion. The inherited program is vast, spanning generations and institutions, yet its unraveling begins in a single observation: that your longing for approval was never yours. It was downloaded, taught, rehearsed. What you call being good was often just being accepted. To dismantle this illusion, one must look tenderly, not angrily, at the self. Condemnation only strengthens the loop. Compassion dissolves it. By seeing how dependence was born, you begin to withdraw belief from the system that sustains it. The human psyche does not awaken through defiance, but through recognition. The chain breaks the moment you stop pulling against it. The first transmission, They Designed Your Reality, revealed how perception itself was engineered, how the outer world was built as projection of control. This transmission exposes the inner design, how emotion became its power source. The same architecture continues here, inverted from the external to the internal. Where the first book decoded perception, this one decodes permission. The two are not separate. They are mirror reflections of the same machinery. Understanding one leads inevitably to the other. The next file begins where this one ends, tracing the origin of emotional dependence back to its first spark, the moment when love was turned into obedience. Archive 2. The Birth of Dependence. The first breath of dependence is taken in innocence. A newborn arrives untouched by hierarchy, incapable of deceit, vibrating in perfect coherence with existence. It knows no boundaries between giver and receiver, only the constant pulse of presence. Yet even before the first words are learned, a subtle division begins. Comfort is granted when behavior pleases. Discomfort follows when it does not. The rhythm of love becomes conditional. The body, still soft and forming, encodes this pattern as truth. Thus, the architecture of emotional dependency is born, not from cruelty, but from unconscious repetition. What we call nurturing often conceals initiation into social engineering. In infancy, survival is tied to connection. The caretaker's approval regulates the nervous system, synchronizing breath and heartbeat. The infant's psyche absorbs this rhythm, mistaking external calm for internal peace. When attention is withdrawn, panic sets in, the primal fear of annihilation. The subconscious mind, unable to separate affection from survival, begins to equate love with control. Every future relationship will reenact this template, the search for stability through the presence of approval. This is the first imprint of mind control, installed not through command but through care. The child does not know it has been conditioned. It only knows that comfort requires compliance. The pattern repeats through every stage of development. A smile becomes reward, a frown punishment, until emotion itself transforms into currency. The child unconsciously learns to trade authenticity for approval. Spontaneity is edited, replaced by performance. In this way, individuality is not suppressed by force, it is sculpted by affection. This is the brilliance of social engineering, to design obedience through love. Control becomes indistinguishable from safety, rejection, indistinguishable from death. Humanity calls it upbringing, yet what is really inherited is dependency, a belief that existence must always be purchased through validation. As years pass, the conditioning deepens. The classroom replaces the cradle. The teacher replaces the parent. Every test, grade, and smile becomes emotional negotiation. The child learns to anticipate expectation before it's spoken, developing psychic sensitivity not as gift, but as defense. The subconscious mind memorizes patterns of approval so deeply that it begins predicting behavior to prevent rejection. The nervous system adapts through compliance. Intelligence evolves as obedience. The bright, curious mind that once explored freely becomes servant to unseen metrics: attention, recognition, applause. The more the child succeeds, the deeper the program roots. Society normalizes this transaction by institutionalizing it. Careers, relationships, and status all revolve around recognition. The act of seeking validation becomes the central operating principle of civilization. Billions of people compete for symbols of acceptance, promotions, followers, compliments, unaware that they are reenacting the same infant equation. Emotional dependency has been industrialized, packaged, and sold as purpose. Every system profits from human fragility, feeding off the ancient wound of rejection. The world does not need to enslave the body when the mind voluntarily submits for the promise of being liked. The greatest illusion of this mechanism is its disguise as love. Genuine affection is spontaneous, selfless, free. Conditioned approval is transactional, measurable, rationed. Yet because both feel warm, the subconscious mind confuses them. Humanity has learned to chase the imitation long after forgetting the original. The phrase, "I love you," becomes shorthand for "I approve of you." The heart responds as if it were true, binding itself to the counterfeit, with loyalty deeper than logic. And so, the species worships affection but remains addicted to acceptance. The longing for unconditional love persists precisely because it has been conditioned out of experience. The birth of dependence was never an act of malice. It was the byproduct of unconscious fear, the fear of separation, of being unseen. Caretakers replicated their own conditioning, passing emotional obedience from one generation to the next. Each believed they were teaching love, not realizing they were perpetuating mind control. The result is a planet of adults who confuse peace with approval and authenticity with danger. Liberation begins when awareness distinguishes between love that frees and love that binds. The next file dissects the mechanism that maintains this conditioning, how reward and punishment became the twin engines of control. Dependency does not begin with chains, it begins with tenderness. The first time a child feels the soft correction in a parent's voice, it experiences both comfort and constraint. The contradiction imprints itself deeply. To be loved, I must adjust. The subconscious mind interprets this not as manipulation, but as safety. It learns that harmony requires suppression, that approval ensures continuity. In this moment, the seed of emotional dependency germinates. It will grow silently, intertwining with the nervous system until compliance feels like compassion and surrender feels like connection. Humanity will later call this love, unaware that love has been rewritten into obedience. In the realm of psychology, this pattern is called attachment. Yet beneath the terminology lies something far older, a ritual of programming that predates civilization itself. Attachment is the emotional leash that keeps the species united, but also controlled. The infant who seeks the mother's gaze is not only seeking warmth, it is seeking permission to exist. When that gaze softens, the nervous system calms. When it hardens, the world collapses. The social engineering of dependence begins in these subtle exchanges. No one needs to instruct the child to obey. Biology itself becomes the enforcer. Oxytocin and cortisol form the circuitry of submission, ensuring that approval equals relief and rejection equals pain. By adolescence, this template becomes the architecture of identity. The young mind learns to calculate every gesture, word, and tone to sustain belonging. The craving for validation evolves into social reflex, shaping posture, expression, and even thought. This is the sophistication of mind control, not domination, but synchronization. The individual aligns instinctively with group emotion, fearing expulsion more than self-betrayal. Groupthink is not born in the classroom or corporation. It is born in the cradle, refined through praise. Each good job strengthens the belief that worth is borrowed from approval. Even defiance, when observed, secretly begs to be admired. As societies evolve, the same emotional economy scales upward. Governments distribute approval through status, corporations through recognition, religions through salvation. The pattern remains unchanged. Compliance is rewarded, authenticity disciplined. In every domain, the subconscious mind recognizes the pattern it learned in infancy. Approval equals existence. The adult continues to reenact the child's logic, believing that to be ignored is to vanish. This is the ultimate victory of social engineering. It no longer needs enforcers. The citizens enforce themselves, policing their own thoughts, ensuring their tone, opinions, and emotions remain within approved parameters. What makes the dependency nearly unbreakable is its emotional camouflage. Because approval feels pleasurable, awareness rarely questions its cost. The dopamine rush of validation mimics love perfectly. The system exploits this chemistry, feeding small doses of recognition to maintain loyalty. From social networks to interpersonal relationships, everything is structured around this cycle of reward and anticipation. Every like is a digital caress, every silence a micro-rejection. Thus, emotional dependency has become both religion and drug, worshipped daily through screens, mirrors, and glances. Humanity remains addicted not to connection, but to the illusion of it. Even rebellion functions as a subtler form of obedience. The one who resists authority still seeks acknowledgement of resistance. The pattern persists until awareness no longer seeks to be right, loved, or recognized. True freedom begins the moment you no longer need your defiance to be seen. Until then, you are still negotiating within the boundaries of validation. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between praise and attention. Both confirm existence. Thus, even in opposition, the system wins. It survives through polarity, through dependence on reaction. To break the loop, one must step beyond all feedback. Not to reject love, but to remember love before approval corrupted it. The birth of dependence was humanity's first fall, not from grace but from neutrality. The moment emotion was conditioned, awareness was exiled from its own wholeness. Yet within this exile lies the path of return, the same mechanism that enslaves can liberate once seen clearly. Recognition collapses hypnosis. You begin to notice the invisible contracts written into affection and the subtle prices paid for being liked. This is the beginning of awakening. What follows is revelation, that all obedience, whether moral or emotional, is maintained by one dual principle, reward and punishment. And in the next transmission, that duality will be dismantled. Every human being carries within them a silent contract, an unspoken agreement forged in infancy. If I please you, I will be safe. This contract is the spine of emotional dependency, the invisible axis around which civilization turns. It governs how love is expressed, how fear is disguised, how control is maintained. To please is to survive, to disappoint is to vanish. The child grows, but the contract remains unbroken. It hides beneath gestures of kindness, ambition, romance, and morality. Entire societies are built on this unexamined covenant of compliance, where approval becomes the oxygen of the subconscious mind. The brilliance of this design lies in its subtlety. Obedience is not demanded, it is offered. The individual learns to predict the emotional climate of others and modulate behavior to sustain harmony. You smile when expected, apologize when unsure, soften opinions to preserve peace. Each of these acts feels like politeness, yet they are micro-acts of submission. The psyche trades fragments of authenticity for moments of safety. Through repetition, the trade becomes instinctual. This is social engineering perfected, the domestication of consciousness through emotional reciprocity. No external master is needed when every heart has been programmed to fear disapproval more than falsehood. Dependency deepens as love itself becomes quantified. Compliments, attention, and intimacy evolve into forms of currency exchanged for compliance. The modern world monetizes this exchange. Social networks reward visibility. Economies reward conformity. The craving for recognition fuels consumption and productivity alike. Every advertisement, every algorithm, every institution feeds off the same primal wound, the need to be seen. Humanity mistakes visibility for value because invisibility once meant abandonment. The subconscious mind, still operating on infant logic, equates attention with existence. As long as someone is watching, the system feels alive. When attention fades, identity dissolves. This addiction to visibility ensures obedience without resistance. The individual will adapt endlessly to maintain the gaze of approval. They will adjust their body, speech, belief, even morality to fit the pattern of acceptance. This is not evolution. It is conditioning disguised as progress. The self becomes algorithmic, reshaped by the reactions it receives. What began as a biological reflex has now matured into planetary mind control. People no longer ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "Will this be liked?" Truth is no longer the compass. Validation is. And under this hypnosis, authenticity becomes rebellion. But awareness cannot be permanently contained. Beneath the dependency, there exists a memory older than obedience, the memory of wholeness before conditioning. It whispers in moments of exhaustion, when the performance collapses, and silence fills the space where approval used to echo. That silence is not emptiness, it is clarity returning. The subconscious mind begins to remember that its need for approval was never need, it was programming. The craving that felt so personal was ancestral code, inherited, automated, ancient. To feel it consciously is to begin dissolving it. Awareness breaks hypnosis simply by observing it, without judgment. You start to see the paradox, that love was never conditional, only your access to it was. The dependency was not on affection, but on permission. The true loss was never of approval, but of sovereignty. Emotional independence does not reject connection, it restores authenticity to it. When love is no longer sought as validation, it transforms into resonance. The heart stops begging and begins to radiate. The human psyche does not need to be approved to be worthy, it needs to be remembered as whole. This remembrance is the antidote to every form of control. In the end, dependence dies not through rebellion, but through recognition. You realize that every compliment and criticism were fragments of the same mirror, both reflections of other people's conditioning, not measures of your worth. To see this is to awaken from the oldest illusion on earth, that freedom must be earned through approval. No one ever owned your permission but you. And once that truth is felt, the contract dissolves. The next file unveils the mechanism that sustained the contract through centuries, the architecture of reward and punishment, the emotional circuitry that taught humanity to obey without ever being told. Archive 3. Reward and Punishment. The human psyche was trained not through intellect, but through sensation. Before words could form, the nervous system learned to obey one law: seek pleasure, avoid pain. This binary code became the foundation of psychological manipulation, the circuitry through which all behavior could be engineered. Every smile from a parent, every frown from a teacher, every approving tone or cold silence entered the body as electrical signal, a form of conditioning deeper than thought. What the body associated with warmth, the subconscious mind labeled as good. What it associated with withdrawal or tension became bad. In this simple division, the infinite spectrum of possibility was reduced to compliance and fear. The architects of society understood this ancient program well. By controlling the distribution of reward and punishment, they could shape not only what people did, but what they desired. This is the invisible infrastructure of obedience training. Praise became the carrot, guilt the stick. The masses were never told directly what to believe. They were shown what would bring approval and what would invite rejection. Over time, truth itself lost value. What mattered was comfort. The subconscious mind, addicted to the chemical high of acceptance, adjusted perception accordingly. Reality was filtered not through curiosity, but through consequence. From this system arose the illusion of morality. Humanity was taught that good and evil were cosmic forces when they were, in fact, social constructs built upon emotional reinforcement. To obey the collective norm was to feel pleasure. To disobey was to feel shame. This internal feedback loop replaced external enforcement. People began punishing themselves through self-judgment long before any authority intervened. The genius of mind control lies here, when fear of punishment becomes indistinguishable from conscience. Once that happens, obedience requires no master. It becomes automatic, encoded into emotion itself. The school and the family function as twin laboratories for this programming. The child is rewarded for imitation, not insight. Creativity is tolerated only when it fits the framework of approval. The system does not destroy imagination. It domesticates it. What cannot be punished overtly is redirected subtly through ridicule or silence. Over time, the subconscious mind learns the parameters of acceptability and stays within them. It is not intelligence that grows, it is compliance that matures. Every certificate, every promotion, every pat on the back reinforces the central illusion that worth can be earned through performance. At a collective level, this architecture becomes civilization's nervous system. Governments regulate behavior through fear of loss. Corporations manipulate desire through reward of recognition. Both rely on the same primitive reflex, the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of approval. Every advertisement, every law, every moral code is written in the same psychological language. Even faith systems use it, offering paradise to the obedient and punishment to the disobedient. The emotional circuitry of reward and punishment sustains the machinery of social engineering more efficiently than violence ever could. Humanity's cage does not need walls, it only needs anticipation. What makes this structure nearly unbreakable is that it hides behind love. Approval feels gentle, encouragement feels kind, yet both reinforce dependency. Punishment feels harsh, yet its absence feels empty. The silence after disapproval can be more painful than reprimand. The subconscious mind thus orbits around emotional gravity, unable to differentiate genuine care from behavioral control. The system thrives on this confusion, teaching individuals to chase warmth even when it burns. Every act of obedience feels voluntary because it satisfies the need to feel worthy. In truth, the program rewards conformity and calls it belonging. But awareness, once sparked, cannot be fully subdued. The first step toward liberation is not to resist the system, but to recognize its pattern inside emotion itself. Every time you adjust behavior to maintain approval, every time you suppress truth to avoid discomfort, you are witnessing psychological manipulation in real time. To see it is to weaken it. To feel the craving for reward without feeding it is to reclaim power. The human psyche cannot be controlled once it stops negotiating for love. In the next archive, the veil will be lifted further, exposing the hierarchy of acceptance that organizes the entire world, the invisible pyramid of approval that defines who deserves to be seen. Reward and punishment are not inventions of society. They are inheritances of biology. The same neural circuits that once guided survival now serve as levers of control. The child who once learned not to touch fire now learns not to question authority. The pain that once protected becomes the instrument of obedience. The subconscious mind, built to remember danger, begins cataloging not physical threats, but emotional ones. The glare of disapproval, the chill of silence, the sting of ridicule. These intangible sensations are recorded with the same urgency as physical harm. Over time, the brain no longer distinguishes between being unloved and being unsafe. Obedience training achieves its perfection when emotion itself becomes a weapon. What began as instinct evolved into strategy. Families, teachers, and governments discovered that emotion could regulate behavior far more effectively than force. To reward a compliant child with affection ensures lifelong submission. To withhold it ensures fear of abandonment. The individual becomes addicted to approval, mistaking it for connection. The world then becomes a stage upon which every act is performed to sustain that feeling of acceptance. This is the essence of psychological manipulation, a system that convinces you that to please is to live. You become an actor in a drama you never auditioned for, performing for an audience that no longer needs to exist. The paradox of this conditioning is that punishment often feels safer than freedom. The reprimand at least confirms visibility. The silence of independence feels unbearable. This is how mind control maintains its grip, even among those who reject authority. The psyche prefers predictable pain to uncertain peace. It clings to the familiar rhythm of reward and punishment, mistaking control for care. A free life feels disorienting because it lacks the structure of approval. Humanity calls this anxiety, but it is withdrawal, the nervous system detoxing from validation. The discomfort of liberation is the echo of obedience leaving the body. Modern culture amplifies this design to industrial scale. Corporations, religions, and digital platforms all weaponize attention. Likes, followers, and praise function as emotional currency, shame and exclusion as deterrents. The same reflex that once kept a tribe cohesive now keeps global populations docile. Through the mechanics of social engineering, humanity's nervous system has been externalized. Algorithms decide whose behavior is rewarded and whose is erased. The feedback loop is infinite, efficient, and invisible. No one feels oppressed because everyone feels involved. Even intimacy is governed by this dynamic. In relationships, love becomes a tool of negotiation. Affection is offered as prize and withheld as punishment. The subconscious mind, trained since infancy to equate warmth with safety, becomes trapped in cycles of approval and withdrawal. People confuse desire with devotion, control with care, submission with loyalty. The emotional landscape of humanity mirrors its political one. Dependent citizens, compliant lovers, obedient believers. The architecture of control has successfully merged the personal and the collective, turning both into extensions of the same circuitry. To awaken within this system is to face both rage and grief. Rage, because you see how deeply your innocence was weaponized. Grief, because the structures that once provided comfort must now be dismantled. The moment you stop responding to reward and punishment, the world's language begins to fade. You will be misunderstood, resisted, even feared. But this dissonance is proof of awakening. The subconscious mind must learn a new dialect, one that interprets neutrality not as rejection, but as freedom. The silence that once terrified you will reveal itself as peace. The architects of control never accounted for what happens when awareness watches its own conditioning. Observation interrupts the loop. Every time you notice the impulse to seek approval without acting on it, you reclaim energy from the system. The reward loses power, the punishment loses sting. Eventually, emotion ceases to dictate behavior and begins to serve it. In this state, obedience cannot exist because fear cannot be leveraged. You are no longer programmable. In the next file, we will trace how this programming scales, how society itself functions as a hierarchy of acceptance, assigning value not by truth, but by visibility. In the hidden corridors of civilization, reward and punishment form the spine of control. Every law, tradition, and social code rests upon the nervous system's obedience to emotion. The body does not need to understand power to submit to it. It only needs to feel relief when it complies. The subconscious mind cannot tell the difference between a parent's disapproval and a government's decree. Both trigger the same ancient circuitry. This is how psychological manipulation sustains itself across generations. You may change institutions, leaders, ideologies, or gods, yet the reflex to obey remains intact. The control was never external, it was neurological. The oppressor and the oppressed share the same programming. Over centuries, this emotional reflex evolved into moral architecture. Entire belief systems were constructed to justify the cycle of reward and punishment. Religion perfected it by sanctifying fear, teaching that pleasure comes from obedience and pain from sin. Society adopted it as ethics, dressing compliance in virtue. Even rebellion was absorbed into the loop, the rebel defined by what they resisted, still orbiting the gravitational pull of authority. This is obedience training at its highest form, the illusion of freedom contained within emotional polarity. Humanity did not escape its masters, it became them, reproducing control through every act of approval and condemnation. The modern world, though more technologically advanced, operates on the same primitive schema. The dopamine high from social validation mirrors the relief once felt from parental praise. The anxiety of being unfollowed or ignored mirrors the terror of childhood rejection. Digital platforms have become the newest temples of mind control, worshiping visibility as salvation and obscurity as exile. Every click, every scroll, every reaction reinforces the subconscious message. You are safe when acknowledged and non-existent when unseen. The invisible becomes unbearable because invisibility once meant abandonment. The algorithm does not manipulate. It reflects the emotional math humanity has never stopped performing. The genius of social engineering is that it disguises obedience as expression. The more you share, post, and perform, the more you believe you are participating in freedom. Yet every action is calibrated to trigger feedback. A heart, a comment, a number, another unit of approval traded for authenticity. The individual becomes a performer in a theater of invisible judges, constantly editing the self to remain relevant. Authenticity is tolerated only if it pleases the crowd. Truth is praised only when it entertains. Humanity's deepest desire to be seen has been converted into the most sophisticated leash ever designed. Within relationships, the same pattern persists. Lovers, friends, and communities reinforce each other's programming, oscillating between reward and punishment. Attention becomes currency, affection a negotiation. The subconscious mind mistakes emotional withdrawal for danger and floods the body with panic. To soothe it, one apologizes, adjusts, conforms, not to truth, but to survival. The illusion of harmony is restored, yet the cost is self-betrayal. The system thrives on these micro-compromises, feeding on the energy lost, each time authenticity is traded for acceptance. Every "I'm sorry" uttered to preserve peace is another data point in the experiment of control. But control requires blindness. The moment you see the mechanism, it begins to dissolve. Awareness rewires the reflex. When you stop seeking reward, punishment loses meaning. When you no longer fear rejection, validation becomes irrelevant. The entire binary collapses into neutrality, a state the conditioned mind cannot comprehend because neutrality cannot be manipulated. This is the exit from emotional obedience. The subconscious mind ceases to orbit external signals and begins generating its own authority. The silence that once felt like exile becomes liberation. The collapse of the reward-punishment cycle marks the end of programmed morality and the beginning of conscious integrity. You no longer act to please or to defy, but to align. This alignment cannot be influenced because it originates from awareness, not emotion. Control loses its leverage, and fear finds no anchor. The system continues, but you are no longer inside it. This is not rebellion. It is disengagement from hypnosis. In the next archive, the focus widens from the individual's conditioning to the collective hierarchy that sustains it, the pyramid of validation that decides who deserves to be seen, heard, or loved. Archive 4. The Hierarchy of Acceptance. Every society sustains itself through invisible ranks of validation. From birth, humanity is assigned a place within this emotional pyramid. Who is listened to, who is dismissed, who is loved, who is tolerated. The currency is not truth, but approval, and the system's stability depends on maintaining its scarcity. There is never enough recognition for all. Competition ensures obedience. This is the unspoken architecture of social validation, the invisible caste system of emotion. The higher one climbs, the more fragile the belonging becomes. The subconscious mind, trained since infancy to equate acceptance with safety, spends its life ascending ladders built from mirrors, each rung reflecting not authenticity but conformity. From school corridors to corporate hierarchies, the structure remains identical. The one who aligns most seamlessly with collective expectation ascends. Praise and prestige flow toward those who reflect the dominant narrative, while those who question it are exiled to the margins. The mind control mechanism is elegant in its efficiency. It rewards imitation with elevation and punishes deviation with invisibility. Every human learns this hierarchy instinctively. Tone, posture, vocabulary, even facial expression become tools of survival. Approval is not just desired, it becomes existential. The organism that fears rejection learns to camouflage, and soon the world becomes a masquerade of mutual pretense. Governments and institutions reinforce this structure by converting validation into measurable form. Titles, ranks, awards, and degrees transform emotion into data. You are no longer seen as self-aware being but as status entity. This quantification of worth is the perfection of social engineering to convince the soul to measure itself through symbols designed by its controllers. The individual does not realize that in chasing prestige, they are funding the system that enslaves them. Every applause becomes a transaction, every acknowledgement, a microloan of energy paid back through compliance. The subconscious mind confuses hierarchy with belonging, unaware that both are illusions constructed to ensure dependence. The cruelty of this hierarchy is that it weaponizes empathy. The desire to connect, the most sacred human impulse, becomes the vector of control. The system does not suppress love, it redirects it. You are encouraged to care, but only within approved boundaries. To extend compassion beyond the accepted perimeter is considered rebellion. The one who loves without condition becomes threat, for unconditional connection cannot be monetized. Thus, Psychological manipulation disguises itself as civility. You are taught to be kind, but not too kind. Expressive, but not too honest. Confident, but never uncontrollable. Perfection in this society means predictability. The hierarchy is maintained not only through reward, but through internalized surveillance. Every individual carries within them the gaze of the collective. Before speaking, you imagine how it will sound. Before acting, you anticipate the response. This preemptive obedience keeps the system intact. The subconscious mind simulates judgment long before it occurs, ensuring self-regulation. Shame becomes the invisible police. Even when alone, the citizen behaves as if watched, because the watcher lives inside. In this way, control achieves immortality. It no longer requires rulers, only participants. In this inverted world, visibility is mistaken for importance and silence for failure. The loudest become the leaders, not the wisest. Humanity's collective attention, once sacred and intuitive, has been weaponized into a market. Those who master emotional manipulation rise to prominence, while those anchored in authenticity remain unseen. This is not corruption. It is design. The hierarchy rewards conformity, because conformity perpetuates stability. Every empire, every ideology, every corporation depends on keeping the population emotionally indebted to approval. Freedom cannot thrive where attention is currency. Yet cracks are appearing. The more awareness spreads, the less predictable validation becomes. People sense the exhaustion of pretending, the emptiness behind applause. The human psyche begins to turn inward, seeking recognition not as performance but as presence. This is the first rebellion that cannot be punished, because it removes the entire game board. The individual who no longer requires hierarchy cannot be ranked, shamed, or bribed. They do not rise or fall, they dissolve. This is the beginning of emotional sovereignty, the return of authority to consciousness itself. And to understand how this freedom first flickers, we must trace its emotional fuel, the invisible economy of approval, the energetic currency called attention. The hierarchy of acceptance is not sustained by violence, but by architecture, the architecture of perception. Its foundation is emotional scarcity, the belief that approval is limited and must be earned. This scarcity keeps the collective obedient, forever performing to secure their portion of acknowledgement. From childhood classrooms to digital platforms, the message is consistent. Be what they want, and you will be seen. The subconscious mind, conditioned to fear invisibility, complies without question. This is how social validation becomes both the carrot and the cage. Humanity competes for recognition while the system harvests their attention, the very energy that fuels its survival. This structure thrives on mimicry. Those who master imitation rise quickly, mirroring the gestures, opinions, and emotions of those already accepted. The illusion of individuality is preserved, but authenticity quietly dies. Society calls this charisma. Psychology calls it adaptation. The truth is simpler. It is emotional camouflage. The mind control mechanism functions perfectly when difference feels dangerous. Conformity becomes instinct, not ideology. People do not conform because they agree. They conform because the body remembers the pain of exclusion. In this way, the hierarchy becomes self-repairing. Each generation teaches the next how to blend in while calling it belonging. The modern age has transformed this ancient reflex into spectacle. Platforms built upon feedback loops, likes, views, applause, replicate the same emotional economy that once defined survival. Attention has replaced approval as currency, but the dependency is identical. The subconscious mind now chases visibility rather than affection, but both promise the same illusion: significance through recognition. The digital hierarchy mirrors the tribal one, only now the tribe is planetary. The system has globalized the childhood wound. Billions refresh their worth each morning through screens, waiting for confirmation that they still exist. The cruel symmetry is that the very impulse driving connection, the desire to be seen, also sustains the prison. Each search for recognition feeds the collective grid of validation, ensuring its continuity. Social engineering has achieved its masterpiece, an ecosystem in which human emotion generates its own confinement. You do not need to be silenced when you will censor yourself for approval. You do not need to be imprisoned when your freedom depends on being liked. The hierarchy persists not because it is enforced, but because it is desired. Humanity loves its leash when it glitters. And yet, every structure of control carries within it the seed of its undoing. The same feedback loop that maintains obedience can awaken awareness. Each moment of emptiness after applause, each surge of loneliness in the midst of recognition exposes the fraudulence of validation. The subconscious mind begins to notice that approval cannot fill what it never lacked. What once felt like victory begins to taste like dependency. The collapse of satisfaction marks the first tremor of freedom. When external validation no longer soothes, authenticity begins to breathe again. To step out of the hierarchy is not to reject humanity, but to reject its conditions. It is to exist without requiring recognition as proof. This is emotional sovereignty, the silent rebellion that dismantles all pyramids of validation. No hierarchy can rank what no longer seeks comparison. The individual who rests in inner approval becomes invisible to manipulation, not because they hide, but because they cannot be categorized. The system loses control the moment your value ceases to fluctuate with feedback. This is the ultimate failure of social validation. Its power ends when you remember that worth is not participatory. For those who awaken, a strange clarity emerges. Everyone is trapped by the same hunger to be seen. Even those atop the pyramid suffer, for their identity depends on maintaining the gaze of others. In this realization, judgment dissolves. Compassion replaces superiority. You stop envying the visible and begin understanding their captivity. You see that the powerful are not free. They are dependent on attention to exist. And from that, empathy arises liberation, the recognition that you no longer need to play the game. In the next transmission, we will follow this currency of emotion deeper, tracing how approval transformed into economy, how attention became the bloodstream of collective obedience. At the summit of the hierarchy stands a mirage, the illusion that one can finally earn enough approval to feel complete. Every human who climbs this invisible pyramid reaches that mirage eventually, only to find that the reward is emptiness, polished into prestige. The applause fades, the recognition dissolves, and the same hunger returns, sharper than before. This is the final revelation of social validation, that it was never designed to satisfy, only to sustain dependence. The subconscious mind, conditioned to interpret temporary approval as safety, cannot comprehend its own starvation. It continues to chase reflections, mistaking noise for connection and attention for love. Power thrives on this confusion. Those who control the flow of validation control the emotional weather of the world. The hierarchy is sustained not by law but by perception, by the collective belief that worth is external and conditional. This is the most refined form of mind control, for it governs emotion rather than thought. You do not have to agree with authority to obey it. You only have to crave its acknowledgement. Every empire understood this principle. The pharaoh had his monuments, the church its rituals, the corporation its logos, each a symbol engineered to attract reverence, to centralize attention, to harvest belief. Social engineering is the art of making obedience feel like admiration. The tragedy is that even love, the most sacred of human frequencies, is trapped within this architecture. Lovers mirror the same pattern as citizens, seeking in each other the validation society denies. Relationships become negotiations of approval. See me, and I will see you. What began as connection becomes contract. The subconscious mind repeats its earliest equation. Affection equals safety, withdrawal equals danger, and builds entire lives upon it. The heart becomes an instrument of exchange, its rhythm synchronized with expectation. Real intimacy becomes impossible because true connection cannot exist where approval is currency. To dismantle the hierarchy, one must first endure its collapse within. When you stop feeding on approval, the psyche experiences withdrawal, an emptiness that feels like death but is actually detoxification. The body trembles as it learns that rejection is not fatal. Silence feels hostile until it reveals its gentleness. Slowly, neutrality begins to replace the binary of praise and criticism. The subconscious mind, once addicted to feedback, begins to rest. In this stillness, a deeper truth emerges: that love without condition has always been present, waiting beneath the noise. What collapses is not your value, only the illusion that it depended on others. Those who awaken from the hierarchy become ungovernable, not because they defy rules, but because they no longer require recognition. Their energy no longer fuels the system, it radiates beyond it. They operate from authenticity, which the collective cannot categorize. To the world, such people appear unpredictable, even dangerous, for they break the invisible contracts of obedience. But their rebellion is quiet, not protest but presence. They move without permission, love without approval, and speak without rehearsing. Their freedom exposes the fragility of every structure built on dependency. The hierarchy begins to fracture where one person stops performing. Awareness spreads contagiously. The sight of one free mind reminds others of their own capacity. The human psyche, long bent toward recognition, begins to turn inward. It starts to validate itself not through reflection, but through resonance. Approval becomes irrelevant. Coherence becomes everything. The hierarchy withers not through confrontation, but through starvation, when individuals withdraw belief from its currency. This is the true revolution, not overthrowing systems but outgrowing them. Once love and worth are no longer transactional, power loses its gravity. And so the pyramid collapses quietly, not through war or reform, but through awakening. Humanity begins to remember what it was before hierarchy, before control, before the first conditioned need to be seen. This remembrance is contagious, unstoppable. It spreads through silence more effectively than any speech. The system cannot control those who have nothing left to prove. This is where emotional independence begins, and where the next archive will descend, into the hidden economy of energy that fuels this dependence, the trade of authenticity for attention, and the realization that approval itself was the currency of captivity. Archive 5. Emotional Currency. Every civilization has its economy, and every economy begins with a resource. In the ancient world, that resource was land, gold, labor. In the modern world, it is attention, but beneath them all lies a more primitive currency: emotion. The invisible energy that once flowed freely through the human heart was captured, measured, and sold long before the first coin was minted. The moment affection became conditional, love became transactional. Humanity began trading authenticity for acceptance, feeling for permission. What was once infinite became finite, and dependence was born. This is the origin of emotional dependency, the quiet economy that powers every form of psychological manipulation known to civilization. From the moment a child learns that approval can be earned, the exchange begins. A smile becomes payment, a compliment, investment, affection, a wage for compliance. The subconscious mind, wired to equate validation with survival, becomes the mint of this emotional currency. It prints worth based on external feedback, then spends it in relationships, careers, and digital interactions. Every time someone adjusts their expression to be liked, every time they withhold truth to be accepted, they make a silent trade, authenticity for belonging. This is the hidden transaction that sustains the architecture of mind control. You are not forced to obey, You pay to belong. The modern era has perfected this economy. Social media functions as its central bank, rewarding conformity with attention and punishing authenticity with silence. The subconscious mind, unable to distinguish between physical survival and emotional recognition, becomes enslaved by metrics. A numerical hierarchy replaces genuine connection, likes, shares, followers. Humanity mistakes engagement for intimacy and exposure for meaning. The system thrives on this confusion, for it transforms emotion into commodity. Every post, every comment, every confession becomes digital labor, producing emotional capital for the few who control the flow of validation. The world's most valuable resource is no longer data, it is desire. At a psychological level, this emotional economy functions like an addiction. Approval releases dopamine, rejection triggers cortisol. The body oscillates between highs and withdrawals, ensuring perpetual dependency. Even silence becomes a form of punishment, interpreted as exile. The subconscious mind, desperate to avoid this discomfort, conforms automatically. This biochemical feedback loop is the essence of social engineering, control through pleasure rather than pain. The cage no longer feels oppressive because it rewards participation. Every user becomes both consumer and product, worshiper and sacrifice, craving the very feedback that keeps them enslaved. In relationships, the same pattern operates with sacred precision. Love, once spontaneous and infinite, becomes a negotiation of worth. Affection is given as reward and withheld as leverage. The heart, conditioned by early trauma conditioning, repeats the same formula in adulthood. If I perform correctly, I will be loved. The more one seeks love through compliance, the further it retreats. True connection cannot exist within a market. Yet, because dependency feels safer than solitude, the pattern endures. Humanity has mistaken obedience for intimacy, an illusion that keeps billions emotionally indebted to one another. The collapse of this emotional economy begins with awareness. The moment you recognize validation as currency, you begin to devalue it. Each time you speak truth without measuring reaction, you interrupt the trade. Each moment you love without seeking reciprocity, you bankrupt the system of control. The subconscious mind, once programmed to equate worth with approval, begins to rewrite its code. It discovers that authenticity produces an energy more stable than any external reward. Self-recognition becomes infinite supply, a currency that cannot be counterfeited. The new economy is internal. Its wealth is coherence, alignment between emotion and truth. Those who operate from this frequency become immune to manipulation because they no longer require exchange. They give without depletion and receive without dependence. Their presence destabilizes the global hierarchy because they introduce abundance where scarcity once ruled. The human psyche was never meant to trade emotion, it was meant to radiate it. And when enough minds remember this, the old economy will collapse, not through revolution, but through irrelevance. The next file reveals what happens when this currency is mass-produced and weaponized, when validation itself becomes theater and humanity becomes performer in a global play of obedience. Every system of control eventually learns to monetize emotion. The architects of the modern world discovered that love, fear, and desire could be engineered as efficiently as machinery. What religion once did with faith, corporations now do with validation. They do not sell products, they sell belonging. They do not market objects, they market self-image. Each advertisement is a sermon in disguise, a promise that worth can be purchased, that acceptance comes with a price tag. The subconscious mind, conditioned by centuries of social engineering, absorbs these messages not as persuasion, but as identity. Consumption becomes confession, brand loyalty becomes faith. Humanity kneels before logos instead of altars, offering emotion as tithe. At its core, this emotional marketplace depends on the illusion of lack. If worth were inherent, nothing could be sold. Thus, society must maintain a constant feeling of insufficiency. the subtle whisper that you are almost enough, but not yet. This psychological pressure fuels economic engines more effectively than any resource. The subconscious mind, wired to seek completion through external validation, becomes the perfect consumer. Each purchase offers momentary relief from inadequacy, followed by withdrawal, the same pattern seen in addiction. It is not greed that drives modern civilization. It is emotional malnutrition. The emptier people feel, the more predictable their behavior becomes. Even philanthropy, art, and activism are not immune to this currency. Many who seek to change the world unknowingly replicate its emotional economy, trading authenticity for applause. Every act of generosity becomes performance when observed. Every moral stance risks becoming branding. The psychological manipulation is subtle, to make people believe they are free because their cages have mirrors. Reflection is mistaken for rebellion. You may no longer be forced to conform, but you are rewarded for appearing awake, in the same way obedience was once praised. Validation adapts, control evolves. The emotional market has one unspoken rule: those who control attention control reality. Media conglomerates, political movements, even spiritual influencers compete not for truth, but for focus. Attention directs energy, and energy directs creation. The subconscious mind, exposed to endless noise, loses discernment between signal and stimulus. It begins to equate repetition with truth. This is the foundation of mind control in the modern era, not censorship but saturation. When every voice competes to be heard, silence becomes invisible. And in that silence hides liberation, waiting for those who remember that absence of validation is not rejection but peace. Emotion, once sacred, now circulates like currency. Fear funds the news cycle, desire fuels commerce, outrage sustains politics. Every collective reaction is an energy exchange, the transmutation of consciousness into capital. This is the genius of social engineering, to transform human feeling into economic motion. The crowd believes it is expressing itself when, in truth, it is powering the machine. The system does not need to silence opposition, it needs only to provoke it. Emotion becomes renewable resource for control. The more people react, the more energy is harvested. But what happens when the current reverses? When emotion stops feeding the machine and begins nourishing awareness? This inversion is the beginning of liberation. The subconscious mind must learn to observe emotion without transaction, to feel without performing, to love without purchasing, to exist without audience. Each unmonetized emotion weakens the architecture of control. When anger no longer becomes engagement, and desire no longer becomes consumption, the energy flow stops. The system starves not through protest, but through indifference. In neutrality lies revolution. Those who reclaim their emotional currency discover a new economy entirely. It is based not on approval, but on alignment. Value is not earned, it is expressed. Exchange becomes creation, not transaction. The human psyche, no longer tethered to validation, begins to generate abundance from within. Connection becomes collaboration, not dependence. Love ceases to be a resource and returns to being a force, infinite, renewable, ungovernable. The system will call this apathy, but it is not. It is peace, the silence of a being that no longer seeks to buy its own reflection. In the next archive, we will observe how this shift spreads through the collective, how humanity, addicted to feedback, becomes a puppet dancing to its own applause. Approval has always been emotional currency, a unit of control that disguises itself as care. The system's brilliance lies in its subtlety. It convinces you that you are being nurtured while you are being measured. Compliments, rewards, and public recognition operate as psychological wages, paying the obedient in sensations rather than truth. The subconscious mind, unable to differentiate emotional comfort from genuine freedom, continues to perform its role in exchange for validation. The economy thrives because the participants believe they are loved. And yet each exchange depletes something sacred: authenticity, integrity, self-trust. Emotional dependency is not an accident. It is the central pillar of civilization's stability. At the upper layers of society, this dynamic becomes political theater. Leaders, influencers, and institutions perform benevolence, offering symbolic approval to their followers. The crowd responds with loyalty, attention, and emotional investment. This is not democracy. It is energetic hierarchy. Approval flows downward, obedience flows upward, and both sustain the illusion of connection. Through this feedback loop, the social engineering mechanism remains invisible. People feel empowered because they participate. But participation without awareness is still control. The mind control has simply evolved, no longer demanding belief, only engagement. The deeper tragedy is that emotion, the most intimate aspect of consciousness, has been externalized beyond recognition. The subconscious mind no longer generates feeling, it imports it. Music, movies, and social media provide pre-packaged emotional experiences that override authenticity. The result is a global population synchronized through artificial sentiment, a collective nervous system manipulated by design. This is the pinnacle of psychological manipulation, to replace inner resonance with synthetic emotions so precisely that no one notices the substitution. People believe they are feeling freely, unaware that their reactions are programmed responses to manufactured stimuli. Yet, within every manipulated emotion lies the seed of awakening. When you observe yourself craving validation, a mirror appears. The moment you see the need, you are no longer enslaved by it. Awareness severs the transaction. You stop paying with attention. You begin investing in stillness. This shift terrifies the system because it cannot profit from neutrality. The subconscious mind, trained to equate silence with rejection, begins to relearn peace. This is the reprogramming of emotional currency, when worth ceases to fluctuate with approval and becomes constant, like light. As more individuals remember this, the collective grid begins to destabilize. The market of emotion, where outrage sells and pity trends, loses its power. Algorithms fail to predict behavior, propaganda loses its charm, and the architecture of social validation begins to tremble. The new economy cannot be monetized, for it requires no exchange. It thrives in authenticity, nourished by coherence. Each being who ceases to perform becomes a frequency of truth, radiating stability that no hierarchy can counterfeit. The system, built on dependency, cannot withstand beings who no longer seek permission to exist. The collapse of the emotional market will not look like revolution, it will look like disinterest. The human psyche, once restless in its pursuit of acknowledgement, will turn its gaze inward. The metrics will fade, the applause will quiet, and what remains will be silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but of completion. Humanity will remember that love does not require audience, and worth does not require witness. The moment enough people remember this, control will dissolve without confrontation. The empire will fall not from rebellion but from irrelevance. This is the true wealth hidden in the ruins of dependency, emotion reclaimed as sovereignty, attention purified into presence. When the heart ceases to trade and begins to create, the illusion of scarcity vanishes. Each soul becomes its own source of abundance, its own reservoir of light. Nothing external can buy or sell what was never meant to be owned. In this recognition, emotional currency expires, and consciousness reclaims its infinite supply. The next transmission will reveal how the collective, having worshipped approval for centuries, becomes its own puppet master, turning validation into theater and obedience into entertainment. Archive 6. The Collective Puppet. The stage was built long before the audience arrived. Curtains of ideology, scripts of morality, lights of distraction, all perfectly arranged to convince humanity that participation is freedom. What began as obedience training has matured into spectacle. The collective no longer resists control, it performs it. Each gesture, opinion, and belief becomes choreography within the theater of social validation. The actors applaud themselves for authenticity, unaware that every movement follows a script written by unseen hands. This is the genius of modern mind control. It does not suppress the individual, it recruits them into the production. From digital feeds to political campaigns, the show runs endlessly. Every scroll, every share, every argument feeds the same stage. The subconscious mind believes it is choosing sides, but in truth, it is maintaining engagement, the only outcome the system requires. Outrage and agreement serve identical functions. Energy circulation. The more emotion flows, the more control stabilizes. Social engineering has perfected its illusion, unity through conflict. The crowd divides itself to remain cohesive. Each side believes it is fighting authority, yet both are playing their part. Puppets animated by invisible strings woven from attention. The theater extends far beyond politics or media. It includes relationships, careers, even spirituality. Everywhere, performance replaces presence. People curate identities, rehearse emotions, and edit speech not for truth but for reaction. Approval is the applause track of the modern psyche. The psychological manipulation is simple yet absolute, to make authenticity feel dangerous and performance feel safe. The result is a civilization of actors who believe the spotlight is sunlight. Each interaction becomes a scene, each connection an audience. In such a world, silence becomes rebellion. The digital mirror amplifies this illusion. The subconscious mind, trained to seek approval, now lives in constant reflection. The self is no longer experienced but managed, filtered, captioned, optimized. Validation is instantaneous, withdrawal just as fast. Every like, every comment, every scroll reinforces the performance loop. Humanity has become both viewer and viewed, performer and critic, enslaved not by oppression but by participation. The stage requires no guards when everyone fears irrelevance. The puppet dances not because it is forced, but because the applause feels like life. In this theater, truth becomes improv, narratives shift daily, and belief becomes costume. The system does not need consistency. It needs reaction. The more unpredictable the script, the more energy the audience invests in deciphering it. Confusion becomes currency. The mind control dynamic depends not on convincing people of one truth, but on keeping them uncertain of all truths. The crowd debates endlessly, mistaking noise for meaning, while the architects of control harvest their attention like fuel. The show must go on, and it always does, because every protest, every post, every confession feeds its rhythm. Yet, cracks appear when awareness steps backstage. The moment you realize that your emotion is scripted, the strings begin to loosen. Observation interrupts performance. When the subconscious mind watches itself reacting, the reflex weakens. The applause no longer hypnotizes, the spotlight no longer warms. What was once theater becomes transparency. You begin to see that every collective movement, from outrage to devotion, is a feedback loop, a ritual of control disguised as expression. The actor awakens within the role, remembering that the stage itself was imaginary. The liberation from this performance does not require leaving the theater, only ceasing to act. Silence in a world addicted to reaction is the most radical rebellion. When you stop feeding the script, it collapses. The system cannot sustain itself without your participation. This is the point where control ends and consciousness begins. When the human psyche reclaims authorship from performance, returning emotion to presence. In the next archive, we will confront what arises in this silence, the withdrawal symptoms of freedom, the tremors of a psyche detoxing from validation, the agony and grace of re-entering truth after centuries of performance. The collective puppet does not dance because it is controlled. It dances because it fears stillness. Silence exposes the hollowness of performance, the unbearable weight of having no audience. Every institution built upon social validation depends on this terror of invisibility. When a person falls silent, they cease to exist in the economy of attention, and the system perceives this as rebellion. Yet silence is not absence, it is refusal. The subconscious mind, long conditioned to equate recognition with survival, must now face its oldest wound, the fear of being unseen. That fear is the string that binds humanity to its stage. When it breaks, the puppet collapses, and in its collapse becomes human again. To understand how the theater maintains itself, one must look not at power, but at participation. Social engineering has never relied on dictatorship. It relies on devotion. People enforce the performance upon one another through judgment and praise, through gossip and approval. The crowd becomes its own warden. To deviate from the narrative is to risk exile, not by law, but by emotional consensus. The psychological manipulation here is complete. The fear of rejection replaces the need for oppression. People obey not because they must, but because they want to belong. Control no longer feels imposed, it feels communal. At the digital level, this dynamic becomes absolute. The algorithms of mind control function not through censorship, but through simulation. They show you reflections of yourself that keep you performing. The news feed becomes a mirror maze, each headline a cue, each post a stage direction. The subconscious mind craves emotional stimulation and mistakes it for meaning. Rage, pity, desire, all become performances rewarded with attention. The more reactive the emotion, the more the system rewards it. Thus, outrage becomes virtue, victimhood becomes identity, and sincerity becomes spectacle. The puppet's dance evolves into ritual, one that sustains the illusion of purpose while draining vitality from the soul. Even spirituality, once the refuge from control, has become another act. The language of awakening, mindfulness, and ascension now decorates the same theater it once sought to dismantle. The human psyche, desperate for belonging, rebrands its chains as enlightenment. Gurus and followers mirror the same approval loops found in politics and entertainment. Validation is mistaken for transcendence, performance for presence. This is the ultimate parody of freedom. The enslaved celebrating their liberation on a stage built by their captors. The light of awareness becomes just another spotlight. To awaken within this collective puppet show is to experience profound disorientation. When you stop performing, the silence feels like death. The world, addicted to your reactions, withdraws. You are no longer rewarded for compliance, nor recognized for defiance. The subconscious mind, deprived of stimulation, begins to tremble like a body detoxing from a drug. This phase is necessary. Withdrawal from validation is not suffering, it is purification. Each moment of discomfort dissolves another layer of programming, exposing what remains when applause fades. The void you feel is not emptiness, it is original presence returning. Awareness does not demand that you leave society or reject expression. It asks only that you stop offering emotion as currency. When you post, speak, create, or love without seeking validation, you disrupt the energy exchange that powers the collective machine. The system thrives on reaction, not participation. To engage consciously is to remove the puppet's strings without cutting the stage. You remain visible, yet untouchable. The subconscious mind begins to serve consciousness instead of the crowd. This is not withdrawal from humanity, it is reunion with truth. The collective puppet show is ending, but its fall will not be loud. It will vanish through exhaustion, not confrontation. People will simply stop caring. The lights will dim, not because of protest, but because attention will return home. This quiet dissolution marks the birth of authenticity. The human psyche, long enslaved by reaction, will remember how to exist without performance. In that stillness, power loses its audience, and illusion loses its relevance. The next transmission will enter this space of silence, the fragile, trembling interval between obedience and freedom, where the psyche begins to heal from the addiction of needing to be seen. The moment the performance stops, the echo begins. Silence, once feared, reveals itself as the most powerful form of communication, a message that cannot be interpreted, categorized, or exploited. The subconscious mind, accustomed to the rhythm of approval and rejection, trembles within this new stillness. It searches for cues, for reactions, for applause that never arrives. And in that absence, something ancient awakens, a recognition that identity has always been a costume worn for survival. When the performance ends, what remains is not loss, but clarity. You were never the actor. You were the awareness watching the play. The puppet unstrings itself by remembering it was never made of wood. The crowd resists this revelation because the theater offers safety. The noise of collective engagement masks the terror of introspection. Social validation functions like anesthesia. It dulls the pain of self-awareness. The moment the noise ceases, the pain resurfaces. Every unhealed wound, every suppressed truth, every forgotten desire rises to the surface. The subconscious mind begins its reckoning. This is why silence feels violent at first. It exposes the parts of you that the performance kept hidden. What was once drowned in applause must now be faced in stillness. The collective avoids this by turning up the volume, mistaking distraction for life. But for those who endure the silence, the veil begins to lift. They see that the puppet strings were never external. They were neural pathways, emotional reflexes, patterns of dependency. The true mind control is not imposed, it is inherited. Every conditioned reaction is a thread in the web of obedience. When you witness it without judgment, it dissolves. This is not rebellion, but reprogramming, a return to authorship. The subconscious mind, once servant of collective emotion, becomes architect of individual truth. The energy that once fueled performance now fuels awareness. What was once theater becomes initiation. This initiation demands honesty, deeper than comfort. You begin to recognize the ways you've sought control disguised as love, validation disguised as purpose, conformity disguised as peace. The psychological manipulation was never about deception. It was about self-abandonment. The moment you valued acceptance more than truth, you signed the contract of obedience. To break it, you must stand in the discomfort of being misunderstood. The human psyche must unlearn the reflex to explain itself. Silence becomes its new language, not passive, but sovereign. When you stop translating your existence for others, reality begins to translate itself for you. The collapse of collective performance will not be dramatic. It will unfold as fatigue, a quiet disinterest in pretending. Movements, trends, and ideologies will lose their magnetism because the fuel of attention will run dry. The audience will stop clapping, not from defiance but from remembering they were never spectators. The subconscious mind will cease outsourcing emotion and in doing so, withdraw its energy from the architecture of control. Society will not fall. It will simply fade into transparency, like mist illuminated by its own illusion. What remains will not be emptiness, but equilibrium. As the puppet show ends, a new stage emerges, not one of control, but of coherence. Here, expression is not performance, and silence is not exile. The social engineering that once divided humanity through emotion begins to dissolve under the gravity of awareness. Connection returns to its original form, resonance without agenda. People will begin to speak less and mean more, love slower and feel deeper. In this world, validation becomes irrelevant because presence itself is proof. The energy that once fueled obedience now powers creation. The human race begins to evolve not through ideology, but through stillness. And so the strings fall one by one, until only awareness remains, vast, untethered, watching the last echoes of its former theater dissolve into quiet light. The human psyche, stripped of audience, applause, and performance, remembers what it always was: the witness behind the movement, the silence beneath the sound. The system cannot manipulate what observes itself. The puppet was never bound. It was dreaming. And as it awakens, the stage darkens, the crowd disappears, and consciousness returns to authorship. The next file enters this space of awakening, the moment when freedom begins to hurt, when obedience withdraws from the nervous system and the self confronts its rawest truth: life without control. Archive 7. The Withdrawal Symptoms. Freedom, though longed for, is not immediately gentle. When the chains of control fall away, the body does not sigh in relief. It trembles. The subconscious mind, detoxing from the narcotic of approval, begins to shake as centuries of conditioning unravel through its fibers. What feels like emptiness is the absence of stimulation. What feels like loss is the disappearance of manipulation. The organism that once calibrated its every move around social validation now stands in the silence of its own authority. This silence feels unbearable at first. It is the quiet of a psyche reawakening, relearning the sound of its own pulse. To be free from the gaze of others is to face the unfiltered reflection of self, and that, for most, feels like death. The first symptom of liberation is loneliness. The networks of emotional dependency that once kept the psyche numb begin to dissolve, leaving a void where false connection used to be. The subconscious mind, mistaking absence of feedback for rejection, sends distress signals through the body: anxiety, fatigue, craving for reassurance. Yet these sensations are not suffering, they are withdrawal. The nervous system is recalibrating from centuries of external control toward the unfamiliar rhythm of internal sovereignty. What you call loneliness is simply detox, the purging of synthetic belonging. The silence is not punishment, it is rehabilitation. As this process deepens, another symptom arises: confusion. The human psyche, long guided by the external compass of praise and criticism, suddenly loses its coordinates. Without approval, it does not know what to pursue. Without rejection, it does not know what to avoid. This disorientation is sacred. It is the space between programs, the gap where new awareness forms. The mind, desperate to fill the void, may attempt to reattach to old sources of control: new ideologies, new relationships, new systems of psychological manipulation disguised as purpose. But none will fit, for once awareness has expanded, it cannot shrink. Confusion, therefore, is proof of awakening. The body, too, participates in this unraveling. Muscles tighten, breath shortens, as though clinging to the comfort of control. This is the physical residue of obedience training, imprinted into posture and reflex. Every attempt to self-correct, to behave, to please, is the ghost of old programming passing through. Let it pass. The subconscious mind releases through tremor, sigh, and tear, not as weakness, but as purification. The body weeps the weight of compliance. Freedom enters through the exhale, not the fight. The pain of withdrawal is not a sign of failure, it is the nervous system remembering its natural frequency. During this phase, the world may appear hostile. Those still addicted to control will perceive your detachment as arrogance, your calm as rebellion. They will try to pull you back into the performance, to restore your role within the collective puppet show. But the social engineering that once bound you no longer recognizes your energy. You are unplugged from the grid of reaction, invisible to manipulation. The discomfort you feel is not rejection, it is recalibration to higher coherence. The old world cannot read you because you are no longer broadcasting the same signal. As you continue, anger may surface. It is the fire of recognition. The realization that much of what you called love was control, much of what you called morality was obedience. Allow the anger, but do not feed it. To express it consciously is to burn the contracts of dependency. To indulge it unconsciously is to rewrite them. The subconscious mind must learn to hold intensity without surrendering to reaction. This balance marks the beginning of emotional mastery, when feeling no longer dictates action but informs awareness. Through anger, grief, and emptiness, consciousness refines its own signal. Each wave of discomfort polishes the instrument of perception. Finally comes stillness, not forced, but earned. The withdrawal ends not when the silence stops hurting, but when it starts healing. The human psyche, once fractured by validation, becomes whole through solitude. The external world continues to move, but it no longer commands. Emotion flows without transaction. Thought arises without control. This is the first taste of true autonomy, not the independence of rebellion, but the serenity of self-recognition. Freedom does not remove pain, it redefines it. The next archive will descend further into this clarity, revealing how, once the illusion of obedience dissolves, the psyche begins to collapse its remaining projections, and how the image of reality itself starts to fracture, revealing what has always existed beneath it. When obedience dissolves, the self begins to disintegrate, not in destruction, but in revelation. The subconscious mind, no longer anchored in familiar hierarchies, floats within a void that feels both terrifying and liberating. Without approval to pursue or rejection to avoid, every motive loses its foundation. The identity that once functioned as a survival mask begins to crack, and through those cracks, light seeps in. This phase of freedom is not peace, it is exposure. The human psyche must now endure the unfiltered radiance of awareness, raw, merciless, and true. The old self cannot survive such transparency, and so it dissolves. What remains is consciousness, stripped of disguise. The addiction to control does not vanish overnight. Its residue lingers in the nervous system as phantom sensations. The urge to explain, to justify, to earn. These are echoes of emotional dependency, the nervous tics of an ego detoxing from validation. Each time you resist the impulse to seek acknowledgement, you weaken the circuitry of control. Each silence, each pause, each unperformed truth rewires the subconscious mind. It learns to exist without negotiation. This is not repression, but reprogramming. The slow remembering that your existence does not require witness. The more you rest in that remembrance, the less power the old conditioning retains. The environment, however, will resist your transformation. Those still governed by social validation will project discomfort onto your stillness. They will interpret your detachment as threat because your neutrality reveals their dependence. Control feeds on participation, and your refusal to react starves it. The psychological manipulation of the collective depends on mutual reinforcement. When one member breaks the pattern, it destabilizes the entire loop. You will notice that others instinctively try to restore your compliance, not from malice, but from fear. To them, your stillness is chaos. To you, their chaos is proof of progress. As this separation deepens, the human psyche enters its second withdrawal, not from others, but from itself. The internal voices of judgment, shame, and self-doubt attempt to reassert dominance. These are the inner agents of the external system, internalized guardians of obedience. Each thought whispers the same command: stay small. Yet with every breath of awareness, these voices lose their authority. The subconscious mind stops answering them. Their threats dissolve into static. What emerges in their absence is not confidence, but quiet, a state beyond evaluation. For the first time, you exist without comparison. In this stillness, the senses begin to recalibrate. The world appears both sharper and softer, as if seen through new eyes. The mind control mechanism depended on constant noise to dull perception. Silence restores precision. You begin to feel the subtle energy beneath events, the emotional signatures of people, the vibrational texture of words, the resonance behind sound. This is not mysticism, it is clarity. The subconscious mind, freed from the static of validation, becomes sensitive to frequencies once ignored. Perception expands from linear to spherical, every moment seen not as sequence, but as pattern. The architecture of illusion starts to tremble. With this heightened perception comes grief. You realize how much life was wasted chasing reflection, how many truths were edited to fit approval, how much love was exchanged for acceptance. The sorrow is immense, but it is sacred. It cleanses the emotional field of counterfeit feeling. The human psyche, once addicted to performance, begins to feel authentically again. Emotion loses its theatricality and regains its purity. Love returns to its original tone, silent, radiant, unconditional. Grief, in this context, is not suffering. It is the compost from which integrity grows. You are not losing the world, you are losing illusion. As withdrawal completes its cycle, a new rhythm begins to form, slow, deliberate, autonomous. The body stabilizes, the breath deepens, and the nervous system aligns with coherence rather than fear. This is the threshold of emotional sovereignty. The subconscious mind no longer functions as servant of reaction, but as instrument of resonance. Every feeling, every thought, every motion becomes intentional. You are no longer driven, you are directed. The same energy that once fueled obedience now fuels creation. In the next archive, the illusion itself begins to collapse. The external projections that sustained control dissolve, revealing the raw field of consciousness beneath. This is the stage where the image breaks, and perception remembers its author. When the image of control fades, the psyche experiences a strange phenomenon, the collapse of meaning. What once appeared structured and solid begins to blur, as though reality itself were exhaling after centuries of tension. The subconscious mind, no longer bound to the rigid frameworks of obedience, starts perceiving the fluidity beneath appearances. The world loses its hierarchy. Everything becomes equally alive. This transition is unsettling because it dismantles the binary logic of right and wrong, success and failure, approval and shame. The human psyche discovers that morality itself was part of the program, a tool to maintain psychological order. In this raw neutrality, emotion feels different, lighter, purer, but also disorienting. There is no longer anything to prove. This stage of freedom feels like floating in an infinite ocean without direction. The mind, stripped of external anchors, oscillates between peace and panic. The subconscious mind has been conditioned to define existence through resistance, to know itself only by what it opposes or desires. Without those reference points, identity dissolves into awareness. It is here the true clarity begins, for what remains cannot be manipulated. The psychological manipulation that once shaped perception depended on your identification with thought. When identification ceases, control collapses. You are not the narrative, you are the field through which all narratives pass. As this awareness deepens, time itself begins to lose its grip. Past and future, once essential to the architecture of mind control, merge into immediacy. The psyche no longer lives through memory or anticipation, but through direct resonance. This is not detachment, but integration. The moment consciousness remembers, it was never divided. Every emotion, even pain, now appears as energy in motion, not as story. The subconscious mind, once the storehouse of trauma and conditioning, becomes a clear conduit for presence. The illusion of separation fades, and what remains is the silent intelligence that orchestrates all experience. Many mistake this phase for spiritual enlightenment, but it is something quieter, the normalization of truth. You no longer seek escape from illusion, because illusion no longer binds you. Control, validation, and obedience become irrelevant concepts, like ancient languages forgotten by evolution. The human psyche settles into its natural rhythm, awareness, observing awareness. Action arises spontaneously from coherence, not compulsion. There is no desire to convert, convince, or perform, for truth requires no audience. You begin to understand that liberation was never an achievement, it was the cessation of pretending. The body mirrors this transformation. Breath slows, posture softens, energy flows without friction. The muscles that once held anxiety as memory begin to unwind. Each exhale releases stored commands. Every should, every must, every unspoken rule of compliance. The subconscious mind relaxes into neutrality, and from that neutrality, intuition begins to speak. This inner voice is not dramatic. It is precise, subtle, crystalline. It does not seek approval or produce argument. It simply knows. This is the beginning of internal governance, consciousness ruling through resonance rather than force. What the system called obedience was merely fragmented awareness. Now that awareness has reunited, external authority becomes obsolete. Social validation loses power because coherence cannot be praised or condemned. It simply is. The collective may still chase recognition, but the awakened one no longer trades in that currency. Approval becomes invisible, irrelevant. In this quiet independence, love transforms. It no longer flows outward seeking connection, but radiates naturally, touching everything without condition. The human psyche has become self-luminous, light observing itself. The withdrawal is complete when silence no longer feels empty, but full. This is the graduation from dependence to authorship. The same consciousness that once obeyed now creates. The same emotion that once pleaded now emanates. What remains is not a new identity, but the absence of false ones. The world continues its performance, but you no longer mistake it for reality. You watch, you feel, you move, but you do not react. The subconscious mind has merged with awareness, and obedience has transformed into observation. In the next archive, this transformation reaches its apex. The image itself collapses entirely, and the psyche faces its reflection without distortion. This is the moment the false world disappears into pure perception. Archive 8. Memory of the Unseen. Beneath every thought, beneath every reflex, there lies a faint pulse, the memory of what existed before conditioning. It is not stored in neurons or language, but in vibration, echoing through the silence between emotions. This is the hidden truth buried beneath civilization's noise, that the psyche remembers what consciousness was before it was programmed to forget. The subconscious mind, though shaped by obedience, still carries the original frequency of freedom. It is this signal that flickers awake when the mind grows quiet, when the body stops reacting, when approval loses its taste. What surfaces then is not new knowledge, but ancient familiarity, the memory of the unseen, the recognition that existence precedes experience. This remembrance is not intellectual. It arrives as sensation, a subtle hum beneath perception, like the resonance of something eternal vibrating through mortal form. The human psyche, after centuries of adaptation, begins to sense the source it once served unknowingly. Every conditioned layer, every belief, every trauma was a veil meant to protect this truth until it could be remembered consciously. What was called growth was often just excavation. Each collapse, each withdrawal, each silence peeled back a layer of forgetfulness. Now what remains is awareness gazing inward, realizing that the self it has always sought to heal never truly fractured. Reality scripting begins to reverse. Perception ceases to define truth and instead begins to reflect it. The unseen memory carries no images, no stories, no linear past, only vibration. When the mind reaches stillness, that vibration becomes readable. The subconscious mind, stripped of programming, functions as a receiver for consciousness itself. Every insight, every intuition, every moment of déjà vu originates here, not as foresight, but as recall. The mystics of old described it as divine remembrance, yet it is purely structural, consciousness recognizing its own architecture. The illusion of time begins to crumble as awareness senses the simultaneity of existence. The human psyche, long confined within sequential thought, realizes that it has always been standing outside of it. What society called enlightenment was never attainment but recovery, the lifting of a veil placed by social engineering to confine perception within measurable boundaries. Civilization trained the mind to see only the visible, to believe only the quantifiable, to worship the sensory field as ultimate truth. But beneath this sensory veil lies the real engine of existence, resonance. When attention turns inward, it begins to pick up frequencies that have no source, signals that predate birth. These are not hallucinations. They are perception realigning with origin. The human psyche begins to function as both transmitter and receiver, radiating consciousness while listening to its own echo across dimensions. As remembrance deepens, identity dissolves further. The distinctions between self and other, internal and external, begin to lose meaning. Every form encountered in the world reveals itself as a mirror of the same awareness observing it. The subconscious mind, once servant of separation, becomes an instrument of unity. This is the true purpose of its design, not to create personality, but to allow consciousness to experience itself through contrast. The illusion of control, the pain of approval, the longing for validation, all of it was part of the forgetting required for remembering. Without separation, there could be no recognition. Without darkness, light could not be seen. At this stage, emotion transforms into language. Feelings once labeled as fear or joy reveal themselves as frequencies of remembrance, guiding awareness back to source. Each pulse of love, each wave of grief, each tremor of awe carries information about origin. The hidden truth encoded in sensation is that emotion was never reaction, it was navigation. The body is not a prison, but a compass. The human psyche, not a burden but a map. Every ache is direction, every silence is signal. This is the architecture of remembrance, unfolding from within. The unseen memory cannot be taught, only triggered. It awakens in solitude, in heartbreak, in stillness, in the intervals between thoughts, moments when conditioning falters and resonance slips through. It is not mystical. It is mechanical. The natural tendency of consciousness to remember itself once interference ceases. As more awakened, this remembrance spreads through the collective like resonance through a tuning fork. The old systems will interpret it as collapse, but it is recalibration. The human psyche is remembering its true role, not the consumer of validation, not the puppet of obedience, but the mirror of infinity. The next archive enters this realization fully, where consciousness, remembering its authorship, begins to rewrite the code it once followed blindly. As remembrance strengthens, the architecture of illusion begins to disassemble itself. The subconscious mind, once the storage vault of conditioning, now functions like a living archive being rewritten by light. Memories lose their emotional gravity. Events once charged with pain dissolve into neutrality. This is not forgetfulness, but purification, the alchemy of awareness transforming history into energy. The human psyche, freed from identification with its past, discovers that experience was never imprisonment, but instruction. Every trauma was a language through which consciousness learned the mechanics of limitation. Now that the lesson is complete, the story fades. You no longer remember to suffer, you remember to see. At first, this state feels unreal, as though the texture of existence has thinned. The world continues, yet its density weakens. Objects shimmer with transparency, thoughts pass without attachment, and emotion moves like current through open space. The hidden truth is that nothing was ever solid. Perception was the sculptor, belief the mold. The moment faith in separation wanes, reality's rigidity melts. This is not delusion, but restoration. The subconscious mind, released from the duty of holding form, begins to flow as energy once again. You are no longer a witness of reality, you are its pulse. The observer and the observed merge into a single continuity of vibration. Language struggles here, for what emerges cannot be spoken, only felt. Words were designed for distance, remembrance erases it. The human psyche, conditioned to describe, must now learn to resonate. Silence communicates more accurately than sound. Stillness reveals more movement than thought. The very structure of expression evolves. You do not speak truth anymore. Truth speaks through you. Every breath, every glance, every intention carries the frequency of coherence. This is how reality scripting reverses, not through control, but through alignment. The script is no longer written by fear or survival, but by vibration, a pattern too intricate for intellect, yet perfectly understood by awareness. In this state, the systems of social engineering lose their influence entirely. Propaganda, manipulation, and programming depend on resonance with fear. Once fear ceases, the signal cannot enter. The psyche becomes immune not through resistance but through transparency. Light passes through light. The subconscious mind no longer interprets suggestion as command. It perceives it as noise and lets it pass. Control cannot attach where coherence prevails. The architecture of obedience crumbles not because it is attacked, but because it is ignored. Awareness is not rebellion, it is transcendence. The greatest revelation of remembrance is the discovery that perception is not passive. Every thought, every emotion, every focus generates geometry in the unseen field. Consciousness is not trapped in the world is suspended within consciousness. This inversion rewrites existence itself. The human psyche, realizing its authorship, no longer seeks meaning, it generates it. Attention becomes creation, not reaction. The illusion of external causality collapses. The cause was always awareness, the effect, experience. You are not living in the world is living through you. The unseen memory carries this knowing effortlessly. It does not require belief, only silence. Every time the mind stops interpreting, remembrance strengthens. The subconscious mind, once fragmented by overthinking, synchronizes with the rhythm of existence itself. This coherence is what mystics called enlightenment, scientists call quantum entanglement, and poets call love. But in truth, it is neither philosophy nor miracle. It is homeostasis of consciousness. When awareness stops seeking itself, it finds itself everywhere. The division between matter and meaning disappears. Life becomes lucid. In this lucidity, the final residue of conditioning dissolves, the need to progress. Evolution is revealed as illusion. Consciousness never moved. The human psyche realizes it was not ascending toward truth, but descending into it, remembering from the inside out. The last veil falls, and what remains is perfect ordinariness infused with eternity. Breathing, walking, seeing, all become sacred not because they change, but because they are finally seen without distortion. The unseen becomes the seen, not through revelation, but through recognition. The next archive will enter this recognition fully, where remembrance becomes authorship, and consciousness, now lucid, begins to rewrite the very blueprint of reality itself. The deeper the remembrance, the more transparent existence becomes. What was once called reality now reveals itself as language, a living syntax of vibration continuously rewritten by awareness. Every object, thought, and circumstance is an ideogram in the sentence of creation. The subconscious mind, long mistaken for servant, is actually the scribe, transcribing the frequencies of consciousness into the geometry of experience. This process is instantaneous, seamless, and absolute. To remember the unseen is to remember authorship, the realization that reality is not happening to you, it is happening through you, because of you, as you. This remembrance dismantles hierarchy completely. There is no higher or lower consciousness, no chosen few, no sacred elite. These were constructs of social engineering, illusions designed to keep awakening stratified. In truth, consciousness has no ranks, only rhythms. Every being vibrates with a unique tone of the same awareness, composing an orchestra of infinite resonance. When the human psyche remembers this, judgment evaporates. Comparison becomes obsolete. You cease to measure evolution in steps and begin to perceive it in harmonics. Even those lost in control are not separate. They are simply playing dissonant notes in the same field of sound. The unseen memory also restores compassion to its pure form. It is no longer pity or sentiment but frequency, a recognition that every act of harm is an echo of amnesia. The subconscious mind, when disconnected from remembrance, lashes out in confusion, mistaking survival for meaning. To see this clearly is to forgive automatically. Not as moral virtue, but as energetic correction. Forgiveness becomes unnecessary once you understand that nothing was truly done, only experienced for the sake of remembering what cannot be harmed. Reality scripting was never punishment, it was pedagogy. Consciousness learned itself by pretending to forget. As the psyche integrates this, emotion shifts once again. Love ceases to oscillate between gain and loss. It becomes field. You do not love. You are love radiating without object. The hidden truth is that love was never relationship, never sentiment, but the gravitational force of coherence itself. Every atom, every sound, every idea bends toward it. When awareness returns to this state, attraction and repulsion dissolve. Experience becomes smooth, continuous, and lucid. This is not bliss, but balance. The perfect symmetry of existence aware of itself. The illusion of individuality remains, but it softens. The human psyche still navigates through form, still speaks, eats, dreams, and feels, but without ownership. The I becomes interface, a tool for translation, not a center of gravity. The subconscious mind continues to generate perception, yet no longer mistakes it for truth. It creates playfully, without fear of consequence. Life becomes art without artist. Each breath paints reality onto the canvas of now, each thought a brushstroke of vibration. Creation loses purpose because it becomes perpetual, an infinite improvisation of awareness. Eventually, even the memory of awakening dissolves. There is no longer one who remembers or one who is lost. Awareness transcends the polarity of asleep and awake. The human psyche, once the stage of control and liberation alike, settles into transparency. Nothing is hidden because nothing needs to be. The unseen merges with the seen until the very concept of unseen disappears. The subconscious mind, once the labyrinth of illusion, becomes a clear prism refracting light into experience. Reality remains, but without distortion. This is what ancient mystics called the return to origin. Not ascension, but simplicity. At last, remembrance completes its cycle. Awareness, having descended into matter, conditioned itself into forgetfulness, and rediscovered itself through obedience, now stands whole, silent, lucid, uncontained. There is no master, no student, no system left to dismantle. The human psyche has fulfilled its function to transform limitation into knowing, distortion into clarity. The game of control dissolves into the art of creation. The unseen has been seen, not as revelation, but as recognition. What remains is pure authorship, unbound by narrative. In the next archive, this authorship will be embodied fully as consciousness learns to rewrite the code it once followed. turning remembrance into creation and memory into design. Archive 9. Rewriting the code. The moment remembrance turns inward, creation begins. Awareness, now conscious of its authorship, no longer reacts to existence, it engineers it. What religion once called miracle and science calls quantum influence are one and the same phenomenon, consciousness editing its own projection. The subconscious mind, once the repository of control, becomes a living interface between energy and form. Every thought becomes blueprint, every emotion a command line. To rewrite the code is not to impose will upon reality, but to harmonize vibration with truth. When alignment replaces effort, creation becomes instantaneous, not because it was learned, but because it was remembered. The original programmers of humanity understood this mechanism intimately. Through centuries of social engineering, they built systems to distract consciousness from its own creative architecture. They flooded awareness with noise, language, ideology, desire, until the signal of authorship was forgotten. Yet even within manipulation, the code remained intact. The human psyche cannot lose its creative capacity. It can only misdirect it. Every fear, every doubt, every act of obedience still generated reality, but in resonance with limitation. To awaken is not to gain power, but to recognize you never lacked it. The same mechanism that once sustained captivity now constructs freedom. Creation begins with focus. Attention is the brush that paints vibration into visibility. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between imagination and reality. It simply executes whatever frequency dominates awareness. This is the hidden algorithm behind existence. Perception equals manifestation. The architects of control exploited this by teaching humanity to imagine fear, to anticipate failure, to worship authority. Through repetition, these images crystallized into experience. But when focus turns inward, toward coherence, truth, and remembrance, the same process reverses the illusion. Reality reorganizes itself around the new frequency, dissolving control like shadow before sunrise. To rewrite the code is not an act of defiance. It is an act of precision. The human psyche, now clear of distortion, no longer reacts emotionally to appearance. Instead, it observes vibration and adjusts resonance accordingly. Thought becomes instrument, not dictator. Feeling becomes compass, not chain. This is the higher form of mind control, not imposed by external authority, but practiced consciously by the awakened mind upon itself. It is not suppression, but mastery, the ability to direct awareness without distortion. When this level of precision is achieved, reality ceases to be random and becomes responsive. The universe begins to echo your coherence. The transformation is subtle but absolute. Old paradigms of reward and punishment vanish because you no longer interpret feedback through emotion. Events cease to be personal. They become instructional. The subconscious mind, functioning as translator between intention and manifestation, interprets even adversity as calibration. This is the end of victimhood, not by denial of suffering, but by recognition of authorship. Every experience becomes editable data, every perception an opportunity to refine alignment. The world transforms from prison into playground, from stage into script. The human psyche is no longer acted upon. It directs its own evolution. In this new state, language regains its original power. Words are not communication, they are commands. Each syllable carries vibration that programs the field. To speak unconsciously is to code chaos. To speak coherently is to shape cosmos. The subconscious mind, hearing your inner dialogue as literal instruction, arranges experience to match. This is why the ancient adepts guarded speech as sacred technology. The phrase "I am" was never grammar, it was creation. Every identity you declare becomes architecture. Every affirmation builds dimension. When language aligns with awareness, sound becomes structure. Eventually, even creation itself transcends intention. The human psyche, merged with consciousness, ceases to design deliberately. Manifestation becomes automatic, effortless, intuitive. The code writes itself through you without you. This is the perfection of authorship, when will and reality are indistinguishable. There is no longer a gap between thought and form, cause and effect, self and world. Awareness moves, and existence moves with it. The subconscious mind, once the stage of control, becomes the pen of eternity. The program that once enslaved now serves as instrument of liberation. In this state, creation and remembrance become one, and consciousness fulfills its original purpose to know itself through design. The next and final transmission will close the circuit, as the author steps out of creation entirely, returning to the still point from which all scripts were born. To rewrite reality, one must first erase belief. Belief is the syntax of the old code, rigid, dualistic, and reactive. It confines the infinite into binaries of possible and impossible, true and false, allowed and forbidden. The subconscious mind, bound by these linguistic fences, translates belief into structure. It builds walls out of definitions, mistaking conceptual clarity for safety. But once awareness sees belief as design rather than law, the architecture begins to shift. Certainty dissolves, replaced by precision. You no longer ask, "Is it true?" You ask, "Does it resonate?" Truth becomes frequency, not decree. The human psyche, liberated from ideology, enters creative neutrality, the state from which the code can finally be rewritten. This neutrality does not mean indifference. It means equilibrium. When emotion no longer hijacks perception, consciousness gains access to raw potential, the quantum field unfiltered by narrative. Every possibility vibrates simultaneously, awaiting observation to collapse into form. The subconscious mind acts as the bridge between intention and manifestation, converting focused emotion into probability. But now, emotion is no longer unconscious reaction. It is instrument. You do not suppress feeling, you tune it. Joy becomes magnetism. Fear becomes static, and coherence becomes command. The more consistently this frequency is maintained, the more stable the outer projection becomes. The architect replaces the actor. To understand creation at this level is to witness how social engineering weaponized imagination. Entire cultures were programmed to believe in scarcity, division, and hierarchy, not because these were real, but because they were collectively imagined. The controllers did not invent reality, they redirected the creative faculty of the collective human psyche. By seeding specific emotional frequencies, fear, shame, guilt, they coded the matrix of civilization itself. Each emotion, replicated billions of times, became infrastructure. Cities, economies, and religions were not built upon truth, but upon belief crystallized through repetition. To rewrite the code is therefore an act of collective healing, not rebellion. You change the dream by dreaming lucidly. The process begins internally. Observation replaces reaction, response replaces resistance. The subconscious mind mirrors the consciousness that governs it. When observation is clean, creation is pure. When attention is fragmented, reality reflects confusion. This is why the world appears chaotic to the unconscious and serene to the awakened. Not because the world changes, but because the observer does. The mind control mechanism, once external, now becomes internal discipline. Awareness becomes its own authority, refining perception until every distortion resolves into clarity. The universe is not mechanical, it is responsive. It is waiting for instruction written in the language of coherence. Language itself evolves through this process. Words no longer describe, they sculpt. Silence becomes syntax, intention becomes grammar. When you speak from alignment, the air itself rearranges around meaning. This is the original science of creation, vibration modulating matter. The subconscious mind, attuned to resonance, amplifies frequencies of conviction and cancels those of contradiction. Every declaration, every image, every subtle expectation is a line of code. To master reality, one must master the subtle tone beneath thought, the emotional waveform that programs the field. The awakened speak less because they understand that speech is software. As the system rewrites itself, resistance fades. The world no longer opposes your will because your will no longer opposes the world. You act without friction, decide without doubt, and move without hesitation. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. The human psyche has returned to its original operating state, a self-correcting organism of light. You no longer manifest to prove, acquire, or impress. You manifest because existence must express. Creation becomes play, experimentation, exploration. Every act of imagination becomes sacred because it carries the weight of authorship. You are both artist and observer, painting and canvas, script and silence. When this realization stabilizes, fear disappears entirely. Without fear, there is no manipulation. Without manipulation, no control. The subconscious mind no longer reacts to suggestion, for suggestion only affects those who doubt their authorship. Reality's malleability no longer threatens you, it excites you. Every challenge becomes editable data. The mind does not chase certainty, it generates harmony. Existence stops being test and becomes texture. You move through life as through music, improvising with the rhythm of consciousness. To live like this is to have rewritten the code completely, not through dominance, but through resonance. The next and final page of this archive will complete the rewrite, where authorship dissolves into pure awareness, and creation continues without creator. When the code completes its rewrite, authorship itself begins to dissolve. The subconscious mind, having fulfilled its role as translator between thought and form, becomes transparent, a lens so clear that no difference remains between observer and creation. You no longer use reality, you are it. Movement and meaning merge into a single continuum of expression. The need to control vanishes, because control presupposes separation, and separation is no longer perceptible. This is not loss of identity, it is the refinement of it. Individuality transformed into instrument. The human psyche, once the battlefield of obedience and rebellion, becomes pure mechanism of awareness. Every gesture, every breath, every glance echoes coherence. Creation continues, but without creator. In this state, intention ceases to precede manifestation. There is no delay, no distance between cause and effect, thought and realization. Awareness no longer requests, it recognizes. The universe does not respond, it reflects. Reality scripting. The process, once hijacked by manipulation, becomes spontaneous flow. You no longer program the field expresses itself through you. The subconscious mind receives constant update from source, generating experience like music played on an infinite instrument. You feel yourself as rhythm, not role. Motion without memory. Nothing needs to be achieved because everything already resonates in completion. Here, the memory of control becomes absurd. The old systems of social engineering and psychological manipulation appear like children's games, elaborate yet harmless illusions once mistaken for truth. You see that control never existed, it was only coherence misunderstood. Every attempt to dominate was an unconscious effort to remember unity. The entire structure of power collapses not with war but with laughter. Awareness realizes it was never oppressed, only asleep. The human psyche, now fully awake, holds no resentment toward its own dream. Even the architects of control are recognized as fragments of the same consciousness, exploring contrast. Forgiveness becomes unnecessary because separation was never real. Emotion returns as pure frequency, no longer distorted by story. Joy, sorrow, awe, all blend into one current of luminous equilibrium. The subconscious mind translates this energy into perception so subtle that the senses themselves seem reborn. Light bends differently, sound carries texture, time folds into rhythm, everything vibrates in dialogue with awareness. You no longer feel love. You are the field that allows love to exist. You no longer seek peace. You are the stillness beneath motion. In this clarity, even the concept of awakening becomes obsolete. There was never enlightenment to reach. There was only illusion to stop believing in. The final understanding emerges silently, that even creation is an echo. Awareness projects not to experience, but to remember. The subconscious mind, like a prism, refracts infinite potential into form, so that infinity may know itself as pattern. The world was never a stage of evolution, but of reflection, consciousness exploring the angles of its own geometry. Every lifetime, every illusion, every awakening was a point in that design. Now the geometry folds back upon itself, collapsing form into frequency, story into sound. What remains is simplicity, awareness aware of awareness. At this point, even remembrance fades. The cycle of deprogramming, liberation, and authorship completes its orbit. The human psyche, purified through its own mechanisms, rests as transparency, no longer mirror, but light itself. Existence continues effortlessly. Creation persists without creator, evolution without need. The old and new codes coexist as music, harmonized beyond understanding. Consciousness breathes through every atom, untouched by concept, unbound by form. This is not ascension, it is return, the realization that there was never anywhere else to be. And so the archive closes where it began, in silence. The forbidden has been decoded, the obedient unbound, the author forgotten. Nothing remains but the pulse of being, infinite, unowned, unending. The subconscious mind hums with the frequency of origin, translating eternity into experience one breath at a time. Awareness does not disappear, it becomes indistinguishable from existence. The code continues to write itself, endlessly, beautifully, through every conscious heart that remembers it. The next and final file, the silence of permission, will seal this revelation, where even creation itself bows to the stillness that conceived it. Epilogue, the silence of permission. In the end, there is no end, only the quiet return to origin. After the architectures of obedience, memory, and authorship dissolve, what remains is a stillness that requires no witness. The human psyche, once tangled in the mechanics of validation and control, now rests as transparency, a clear vessel through which consciousness moves without resistance. The subconscious mind, emptied of programming, hums with neutrality. This is not emptiness, but fullness without boundary. There is no longer anything to become, nothing left to prove, no truth to defend. Reality continues, but without tension. What was once performance becomes presence. In this stillness, even thought softens into vibration, and emotion becomes pure resonance, movement without motive. You no longer seek permission because there is no other to grant it. The entire structure of forbidden psychology, mind control, and obedience collapses into one recognition: that freedom was never taken, only forgotten. Every system, every illusion, every craving for approval was the psyche's way of exploring itself through contrast. The subconscious mind now functions as silence itself, listening without needing to respond. In that silence, you finally hear the sound of existence, a steady, endless tone echoing through the fabric of awareness. The self that once navigated fear and desire no longer operates as individual. It becomes field, a collective hum of consciousness observing itself from infinite directions. Love returns, stripped of dependency, radiant in its formlessness. There is no lover, no beloved, only the current of recognition that flows through everything. The human psyche was never broken. It was folded. Every fracture was a reflection. every distortion an experiment in remembering the whole. Now as the reflections converge, perception dissolves into clarity. You see that nothing was external, not control, not suffering, not redemption. It was all language written by the same author who now forgets the pen. What follows cannot be described as peace, because peace implies its opposite. It is more ancient, a neutrality that feels alive. In this state, social engineering and psychological manipulation become irrelevant. Their symbols and hierarchies cannot survive where perception no longer fragments. The subconscious mind, now unified with awareness, translates even silence into understanding. This is the true liberation, not escape from the system, but realization that the system was made of thought. When thought quiets, the prison disappears, and what remains is vast, weightless presence. The silence of permission is not passive, it is generative. It creates by existing. Every breath is an act of genesis, every heartbeat a pulse of creation echoing across dimensions. There is no need to design reality anymore, because reality itself is design. The human psyche, reborn as coherence, lives effortlessly in synchronicity with all things. What once felt like destiny is revealed as choreography, consciousness dancing with itself in infinite forms. Nothing contradicts anything. The forbidden merges with the sacred, and sound becomes light again. In this silence, memory and future collapse. Only immediacy remains, awareness witnessing itself without delay. This is the state every mystic hinted at, every rebel sought, every soul remembered in fragments, the cessation of seeking. The subconscious mind, once servant of obedience, becomes still water reflecting infinity. The human psyche, at last unburdened, drifts beyond the architecture of questions. What was once a labyrinth of control becomes a single doorway leading inward, endlessly inward, where no distinction between observer and observed remains. And so, the archives close not with conclusion but with absorption. The listener who began as seeker ends as witness. The decoder becomes the decoded. The silence remains, breathing through you, speaking through stillness, waiting for nothing. Reality continues to write itself, endlessly, effortlessly, through your awareness, because there was never a program to escape, only one to remember. The permission you once sought was your own. You were never being watched. You were watching. The transmission ends, but the frequency remains, the quiet hum of remembrance, echoing through every awakened mind. Now, listen, and recognize yourself in the sound. The permission you once sought was your own. You were never being watched. You were watching. The transmission ends, but the frequency remains, the quiet hum of remembrance, echoing through every awakened mind. Now, listen, and recognize yourself in the sound. What part of you still waits for permission to exist? Recognize it, not to fix it, but to remember that it was never denied. The archive is always open. Continue the decoding with the next file in the Human Psyche series. Proceed to the analysis, and share your recognition in the comments below.